closing argument of the state. Go ahead, Ms. Hughes.
Chloe Chandler was a 5-year-old girl who skipped down the hallways at school. But because of what happened on July 19th, 2018, she will never graduate from kindergarten. She'll never go on to high school, graduate from high school. She'll never be able to go on to college. She won't get her first job. She won't have her first boyfriend or get married. She also won't be able to see her little brother Phoenix grow up or do any of his first-time things. She was a beautiful girl who had so much life to live. But that life was brutally taken from her when she was strangled to death by her mother. We all know what a mother's supposed to do. Protect you, love you, watch over you, care for you. All things that I'm sure the defendant was trying to do. But it all became too much for her because on July 19th, 2018, the defendant decided she was finally going to get that break that she thinks she deserved and needed. We would have loved for you to meet Chloe, but you couldn't. The defendant made sure that July 19th, 2018 was the last day Chloe was on this earth. That was the day that the defendant turned this beautiful, vibrant, lovely little girl from this to this. You now know how this day started. The defendant didn't want to deal with Chloe that day. She left Chloe home with Aaron while Aaron was sleeping. Aaron didn't know she was there, and Kelsey, the defendant, went to run errands with her dad and her son, Phoenix. The defendant came home with her son, Phoenix, and she saw that Chloe was watching TV. She asked Chloe what she was doing and why she was watching TV and why she wasn't in her room alone. At some point, Chloe had told the defendant she was hungry. The defendant made some ravioli for Phoenix and Chloe. Aaron got up from sleeping. He got ready to go to his friend's house so that he could do some work on a friend's car. The defendant had to take care of her kids again that day on her own, and she wasn't happy about it. She wanted to put the kids down for a nap because she wanted to sleep. She was tired and she needed 2 hours of sleep before she went to work. The defendant told Chloe, "You're going to take a nap or I'm going to beat your ass," because she wanted to make sure she could rest. Chloe, like any other normal 5-year-old, didn't want to take a nap. So she ran away from that bed. And what did her mother do? She took those pajama pants, she threw them over her, pulled back, and strangled her with those pajama pants. She didn't want to deal with Chloe's attitude anymore. She had had enough. She was sick of dealing with her bad behavior, so she used those pajama pants as her mechanism to kill Chloe. In Chloe's last moments on this earth, she would fight for her life, staring at her own mother. She took her last breaths in her own bedroom, where her mother made sure she wasn't here today to tell her story about what she did that day. Afterwards, the defendant didn't know what to do. It was too late for Chloe, but she had to do something to save herself. She had to come up with a story. She had hours to think about this. She had to come up with a story that would explain the marks on Chloe's neck. Since she was the only one home besides her 2-year-old son, Phoenix, she had to make it look like an accident. She called 911 and said that she found her daughter hanging in the closet. She was hoping everyone would believe her, that they just wouldn't ask any questions. At that point, Chloe was already dead. Corey Binge told you he was the first responder and that when he went there, he felt her extremities and that they were already cold. He told you that he normally wouldn't have even done CPR or performed life-saving measures on somebody, but he did it desperately hoping that he could save Chloe's life or bring her back to life. But he told you she never had a pulse from when he went and started those life-saving measures. Later that night, you heard about how the defendant talked to Sergeant Leffler, briefly on scene, and then later at the hospital. And that was the audio. It was actually a video, but you couldn't really see anything on the video. But you could hear Sergeant Leffler asking the defendant questions about what happened. And that's when she said that she found Chloe hanging from the closet, hanging from the pajama pants, that came undone when she pulled her out. These pajama pants that she wants you to believe held the weight of her daughter to the point that it caused her to go unconscious and then killed her. They just came off the rod, just like that. Later that night, a few hours later, you heard from Kelly, the defendant's mom. She told you she heard that something had happened to Chloe. The defendant didn't call her to tell her what happened. So she called her and said, "What are you doing?" And the defendant's response, several hours after she supposedly found her daughter dead, was eating. Then her mom asked her, "How's Chloe?" And what was her response then? "How did you find out?" I don't care how close you are to your family or to your mother, that is an absolutely ridiculous response when you just found your daughter dead. That's what they want you to believe. The next day, the police wanted to go through with what happened. Investigator Siren went over to the house and met with Aaron and Kelsey to talk and walk through what exactly happened that day. And you were able to see that video. And you'll be able to take, like the judge told you, the exhibits back, the evidence, to view if you choose. Look through those videos. Look through all the different audios that we put into evidence. Specifically in that interview, determine for yourself if you believe that the defendant is telling the truth. When she talks about how she went to the closet and she found Chloe hanging, facing this area, and she specifically talks about that chair, that she's not above that chair, that the chair is to the side, and that the chair was in the same position it's always in. She also talks about the pants again. And during that interview, she says that when she took Chloe out of the pants, that her head came right out. And she indicated that the pants stayed on the rod. Look at the defendant's demeanor during that interview. Of course, people act differently in different situations. Trauma affects everybody differently. But ask yourself what you think about Kelsey's demeanor during that interview. How she's talking to the police about this horrible, tragic event that just happened, about 23 hours after she supposedly found her daughter hanging in this closet. The defendant's cousin, Brittany Johnson, wanted to help, so she told you. She went to the police station and then decided that day, this is the day after Chloe's death, to go over to the defendant's house and to talk to them. And Brittany Johnson told you about the demeanor that she witnessed that day, that it just didn't seem right. That she was with the defendant and Aaron for a few hours, and they were talking about what had happened. And Brittany Johnson told you that during that conversation, the defendant said that she had witnessed her own daughter die. She also told you that she was talking about Chloe specifically and talking about her bad attitude, how it was hard to look at her sometimes because she looked so much like her father that cheated on the defendant when she was pregnant with her. She also told you that the defendant was mad that the police were investigating this. Again, very peculiar behavior. A few days later was Chloe's autopsy. Dr. Catalier told you that Chloe's injuries were not consistent with a hanging. There was a lot of injury, and there was a struggle. Because force equals injury, and Chloe had a lot of injury. This wasn't a hanging. This was a strangulation, a manual strangulation, where Chloe fought for her life. The officers continued the investigation, and they asked both Kelsey and Aaron to come down to the police station to speak with them. And the defendant went to the police station on her own and talked to them. And that was that first interview where you saw, I think it was about 30 clips of a 6-hour interview. And during that interview, the defendant initially says that she left Chloe at home that day because she was sleeping when she left. This was prior to the events that happened. Then she comes back and says, well, I didn't leave her at home because she was sleeping. I just left her at home because I didn't want to deal with her. So I left her at home while Aaron was sleeping. Why didn't she tell the truth about that at first? She also talked about the pants again in that interview. She talked about how the pants came off of Chloe, but then she wasn't sure if they came off of the rod or off of Chloe because she didn't know what actually happened to those pants. Every time they were asking her, there was something different. She talked a lot in that interview also about Chloe's behavior and how Chloe had started acting out. She didn't listen. She would do whatever she wanted regardless of what you told her to do. That she was acting out for attention, just giving you a little bit of a clue of what was going on in the defendant's mind. She initially said, no, I never asked any family members for help. Then she comes back and says, well, yeah, I asked my dad a week or two ago. And she also says, well, maybe I asked my mom to take her for a weekend. It's also during that interview when the police ask her, because she's talking about how Aaron never turned out to be the father she thought he would be, have you ever had a break? And her response was, now. Kelsey left on her own that day and agreed to come back to do a second interview because the police wanted to talk to her further and to talk to her more about what had happened. And you saw most of that entire interview. It was pretty lengthy. And obviously, if you need to watch it again, go for it and watch it and watch the defendant's demeanor, watch her behavior, watch and listen to the things that she says. She initially starts saying, well, I pushed on her chest and told her she just needed to stay. It's nap time. You need to go to sleep or I will beat your ass. And she walked out. Then she starts talking a little bit more, says, well, when I pushed on her chest, she looked awake when I left. I thought she was awake, so I went to sleep. She told the investigators in that interview she just wanted to sleep. She was so freaking tired. She just wanted to take a nap. She wanted 2 hours. She talked about how hard it was taking care of 2 kids. When she works as much as she does, she has a husband that doesn't give a fuck, to be honest with you. That's what she said to the investigators. She started giving lots of different versions of what actually happened that day. And of course the officers keep asking questions. Are they supposed to just say okay and walk out of the room? No, they're still talking to Kelsey about what happened. They're asking her about the evidence. She then starts talking more about what happened. She initially confesses, but she's still minimizing, still not saying exactly what happened. And then she does. She talks about how she put one foot in front of the other, and that she then took those pajama pants and threw them over Chloe's head. She even makes the movement and does it, showing the investigators several times that that's what she did with those pajama pants. She talks about how Chloe started shaking and moving when she did that, how she got wobbly and started to go down. She then talks about how she picked her up and put her on the bed. She even said at that point she was still so angry. It had came to her mind at that point she might be gone, but she hoped that she wasn't. So she had decided she was going to go and take a nap and hope that when she came back, she was alive. She said in that interview, her heart was racing, and she was still so angry when she left that room. She talked about how then she went and laid in bed for approximately 2 hours and maybe closed her eyes for some of that time. Now, those are the facts, and that's the evidence that we presented to you. When you go back into the jury room to complete your deliberations, there are 3 tools that you take with you. The first is the evidence and the facts. That's everything that came from this witness stand, as well as the evidence and the exhibits that have been admitted into evidence. The facts that came to you through those witnesses. The second tool is the law, and Judge Gammon just read the law to you and gave you copies of it as well. And you have to apply the law to the facts and the evidence presented in the case. The third tool, and probably the most important tool, is your common sense. Your collective common sense that comes from your everyday life experiences. You are definitely allowed to use that. Don't check that at the door when you go in there to deliberate. Use your common sense to evaluate the facts and the evidence and apply the law. And I'm confident that the only verdict that you will come up with is a verdict of guilty. As the judge just read to you in one of the instructions, you have a duty in this case. When we started this trial 6 days ago, you all took an oath to follow that oath, and you have a duty, like I said, that the judge just read to you. You have a duty. Your sole duty is to find the truth and do justice. One of the other instructions that the judge just read to you, and something that we talked about a little bit in jury selection, is direct and circumstantial evidence. That instruction indicates, in considering all the evidence, make deductions and reach conclusions according to common sense. Facts may be proved by direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, or both. Circumstantial evidence is evidence about a chain of facts which show a defendant is guilty or not guilty. The law makes no distinction between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. We only have to prove the elements of the crime charged. We also talked about this in jury selection. It is the state's burden of proof to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed murder and child endangerment resulting in death. So let's go over each of those counts. First, when we're talking about murder in the first degree, the state must prove all of the following elements of murder in the first degree. First, on or about the 19th day of July, 2018, the defendant strangled Chloe Chandler. How do we know that the defendant strangled Chloe? There's absolutely no one else home. There's no signs of anyone else in the house. In several of Kelsey's interviews, she talks about how she didn't hear anything, she didn't see anything. There's no evidence of struggle. We know the only people in that house are the defendant, Chloe, and her two-year-old son. When you look at the scene photos and the evidence or the testimony that came to you from the officers and the first responding officers, you heard that there's no vomit in that closet because Chloe was never in that closet. That was the defendant's story when she was trying to come up with something. The pants and the vomit are both on the bed. That's consistent with what the defendant tells you. It corroborates her story. Those pants aren't in the closet. Even if you believe her first, second, third version about what happened to those pants, why would she pick up those pants and put them on the bed? This is somebody, if you believe her story, that walks into this room and sees her daughter hanging there. Even if you believe the pants fell off, why would you then pick up the pants and bring them on the bed? Because that never happened. The pants were on the bed because she dropped them after she strangled her, just like she told you through her confession. This hanging was not possible based on the photos you saw, based on everything that you heard. First, you would have to believe that Chloe tied this double knot. Yes, she can tie her shoes. But to think that this child, a 5-year-old, could tie a double knot to the point that her head would fall into it. And you would have to believe essentially that she jumped into it. Because Chloe, if you believe Kelsey's first story and believe all of this, she even talks about how the chair is off to the side. So you would have to believe that she just jumped and happened to fall into this opening. And even if you believe that, what about, I just showed you that photo. There's no evidence of struggle in that closet. There's nothing, no damage to that closet rod, nothing to there's those 3 bars where Kelsey wants you to believe she's facing in that other part of the closet. If you really believe that Chloe had accidentally hung herself, she could have taken her feet and swung them on that. You would have seen evidence of something. If you really believe that this happened in the closet, there would have been vomit in the closet. There was no vomit in the closet because Chloe wasn't in the closet. It was on the bed after the defendant took her and put her on the bed, just like she told you. We also know that the defendant strangled Chloe by her actions, both before and after Chloe's death. You heard from her mom and her cousin about how ever since Phoenix was born, that Chloe was just a nuisance to the defendant. Chloe reminded her of her father that cheated on her. She talked about Chloe's bad behavior. She asked her mother to take Chloe. And she didn't tell her daughter after about the death. You can consider all of this. We also know, based on the defendant's demeanor in the interviews, look at her demeanor in all of them. Rewatch them if you need to. I know you guys were all paying attention. And then we've also had the defendant's confession. She talked about what happened that day. She knew facts that nobody else knew because it was only her and Chloe in that room that day. Not only do you have that, you have the letter that she wrote to her family afterwards. You saw on the video, she sat there for, 7-10 minutes writing that letter. Nobody was forcing her to do that. Then you also have the phone calls. Later that night, she calls her husband and says she's sorry. I didn't mean to hurt her. And then 24 hours later, on the next day, she says the same thing to her husband again. Nobody's forcing her to say anything. We also have the medical evidence. Dr. Catalaire told you hangings cause little or no injuries. Strangulations have more injuries because of struggle and force. And that makes sense. I know Dr. Catalaire's testimony was very long and she gave you lots of different examples. She told you that in hangings, when somebody starts hanging themselves, the noose goes up and you generally see injuries higher in the neck. And what happens is the person loses consciousness within 3 to 15 seconds. She told you how that's different than a strangulation. When there's a struggle, when there's friction, when there's force. And that's what she observed here, both on the injuries on the outside of Chloe's neck and the inside of her neck. She told you that there was evidence of blunt force injury to her neck, and there was injuries to both sides of her neck. That there was a deep hemorrhage to the back of her neck, an injury to the carotid artery. She told you that the cause of death was strangulation. Look at the photos. Obviously, those are also part of evidence. When you look at all of the injuries that Chloe had, this wasn't somebody that just accidentally hung themselves. This was somebody who was fighting for their lives, struggling to survive. Now, Dr. Catalaire also talked to you about this area specifically, about how she believes that this is an outline of Chloe's hand. It might not be that easy to see, but in the photos, it's a little bit easier to see. She told you how at the bottom of that, it looks like there's scratches. Don't take Dr. Kettler's word for it. Examine those photos yourself. You are the finders of fact. And when you look at that, it's just another piece of evidence that shows how Chloe was struggling to survive. We have proven the first element, that on that date, the defendant strangled Chloe Chandler. The second element is that Chloe Chandler was under the age of 14. That is not disputed. Chloe was 5 years old when she died, so we've proven that element. The third element is that Chloe Chandler died as a result of being strangled by the defendant. Oh. So go ahead, do you want? The third element, Chloe Chandler died as a result of being strangled by the defendant. And there's a further instruction that says, the strangulation by the defendant resulted in death of Chloe Chandler if it caused or directly contributed to Chloe Chandler's death. We know that the way that Chloe died that day was from the injuries that she had. And we know that it came from her mother, the defendant, based on what we've already talked about. We know that on that day, Chloe Chandler died as a result of being strangled by the defendant. We've proven that element. Fourth, the defendant acted with malice aforethought. Malice aforethought is a state of mind which leads one to intentionally do a wrongful act to the injury of another in disregard of the rights of another out of actual hatred or with an evil or unlawful purpose. It may be established by evidence of actual hatred or by proof of a deliberate or fixed intent to do injury. Fixed purpose or design to do some physical harm to another which exists before the act is committed. It does not have to exist for any particular length of time. We know that the defendant intended to do this act. She intended to cause injury to Chloe Chandler. There is no other intent when you take pajama pants and use them in the way that she did. She clearly disregarded Chloe's rights out of both actual hatred and with an evil and unlawful purpose. Again, there's no purpose other than an unlawful one when you do that. She was acting at that moment out of hatred and evil as well. And we know that based on what she told you. She was so angry while this was happening and after. We also know what the defendant did was systematic and deliberate. She picked up those pants and she used them. She talked about when she continued to carry out the act that Chloe's body was reacting. It was wobbling, it was shaking. It wasn't in the heat of the moment where she just got angry and then all of a sudden stopped and was like, oh my goodness, what did I do? We know, based on the injuries, that there was struggle. Chloe fought for her life. As Dr. Kettler told you, injury equals force involved. When you think about Chloe's injuries, both on the outside of her neck and all of the internal injuries, we know that the defendant acted with malice aforethought. We have proven that fourth element. Fifth, the defendant was committing the offense of assault against Chloe Chandler. And there's also a definition of assault. And what the state needs to prove for that element is that the defendant did an act which was specifically intended to cause pain or injury to Chloe Chandler. And that seems a little bit redundant. We've already talked about that. But the defendant's act specifically intended to cause pain to Chloe. It intended to cause injury. It caused her death. And we know that the defendant had the apparent ability to do the act. She did the act. We have proven that fifth element. Sixth, that Chloe Chandler's death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. The defendant's actions showed indifference to Chloe's life. She picked up those pajama pants and she used them. She continued to use them on her until she took her life. She strangled her with those pajama pants. Like we've talked about, those injuries were 4 levels deep. Dr. Kettler told you about how she peeled away the skin and then the muscles and all of the different injuries that she observed. Another way that we know that there was indifference to human life, the defendant waited hours to call the police. She had decided that she was going to go take a nap and hope that she was awake, didn't do anything to save her life, didn't call 911. She didn't want to deal with her. We have proven that sixth element, that Chloe Chandler's death occurred under circumstances showing an extreme indifference to human life. We have proven murder in the first degree. The second count is child endangerment resulting in death. The state must prove all of the following elements of child endangerment resulting in death. First, on or about the 19th day of July 2018, the defendant was the parent or a person having custody or control of Chloe Chandler. Again, this is not disputed. We all know that the defendant was Chloe's mother. We also know she was home alone with Chloe that day and her son Phoenix. We know that from Aaron, we know that from the defendant's statements, and we know that from the first responders. So we have proven that first element. The second is that Chloe Chandler was under the age of 14 years. We also know that she was 5 at the time that this happened, so we have proven that second element. The third, the defendant intentionally committed an act or series of acts which used unreasonable force, torture, or cruelty that resulted in physical injury to Chloe Chandler. We know based on what the defendant did that day that those acts were unreasonable because they caused Chloe's death. We know that they were unreasonable because no mother, no person should ever take their hands and use them either by themselves or with some type of device to strangle somebody. We know that that's torture. We know that what she did caused physical injury to Chloe. So we have proven that proposition. And the last element is that the defendant's acts resulted in the death of Chloe Chandler. And again, we know based on everything we've talked about and the evidence and the witnesses that what happened that day caused Chloe Chandler's death. So we have proven that last element. We have proven the defendant guilty of both murder in the first degree and child endangerment resulting in death. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, and the trail of evidence leads to only one place, to where Chloe's murderer sits across this courtroom from you today. And make no mistake, the defendant earned that seat in this courtroom by what she did that day, by her actions, her choices. Today is the day that you make her take responsibility for that. On July 19th, 2018, the defendant turned Chloe's bedroom, a place that a child should cherish and feel safe, into her murder scene. She made sure that Chloe wasn't here to tell you what happened that day. But over the last 6 days, Chloe's voice has finally been heard again. It's been heard in this courtroom every day through the witnesses and the evidence and the exhibits. Chloe's telling you, she showed you through all of the witnesses and the testimony that the defendant is the one that did this to her. She's the one that committed this vicious and senseless murder. Chloe must have been terrified that day as she fought for her life, pleading with her mother to stop. The nightmare started that day for this innocent 5-year-old who was sweet and who had her whole life ahead of her. But it's been going on since that day. This nightmare started that day for her family, her friends, for everybody that's had to deal with the loss of this little girl. But today, this nightmare finally ends. It finally ends because today is the day that Chloe gets the justice she deserves. Today is the day you find the defendant guilty of both murder in the first degree and child endangerment resulting in death.
Members of the jury, you have heard the state's final argument. We are now going to take an early lunch break. When we come back, we will have the defendant's final argument. We are now going to proceed with defendant's closing argument. Go ahead, Mr. Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. If it may please the court, counsel. ladies and gentlemen of the jury. This is finally my opportunity to make my arguments. And as you know, this is the case of the state of Iowa versus Kelsey Thomas. And this criminal case, just like we had talked about during voir dire, starts where every criminal case starts, and that's with the presumption of innocence. And that presumption of innocence in this particular case is instruction number 3. That tells you that Kelsey Thomas is presumed innocent and not guilty. It requires you to set aside any suspicion you might have of her until you hear evidence that actually establishes in your minds that she is in fact guilty. And as I took notes and thought about the state's opening summation, there's really not a whole lot of evidence that the state discusses. So it's easy to get carried away, just like I predicted, and say, well, there's all this evidence, we have to find her guilty. Well, let's take a look at that evidence, and that's hopefully what we're going to be able to do here with the presentation. Now, another thing I want to point out, and I'm sure you're aware, Kelsey Thomas did not testify in this case, and she's not required to. And if you think about all the information that you've already heard from Kelsey Thomas, you have to ask yourself, what really more could she add? Kelsey Thomas was questioned for 14 hours, in addition to conversations and everything else with lots of family members. Her story was always the same. You can imagine that if she did testify, you're really not going to get any new information. It's really just going to be, well, do we want to believe her or not? And that's going to be based on the evidence. So, again, if you had some concerns about Kelsey Thomas testifying, you heard her story. You heard hours and hours of her being questioned. And you only get a portion of that, but even in that portion, you'll get an idea of what thought processes were actually Kelsey Thomas's, and what thought processes were investigators, maybe their overactive imaginations, and the things that Kelsey Thomas adopted from law enforcement. So, despite the fact that Kelsey Thomas did not testify, you folks still have to have the state prove her guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And again, as it relates to her not testifying here in this case, I'd point out she completely cooperated with every aspect of the investigation. She was questioned for 14 hours, and her story remained consistent throughout the first 12 of those 14 hours. So there'd really not be any purpose other than to give the state another opportunity to call her a liar, to go through the same process that she had just experienced on July 26th in those 3 hours of interrogation that you folks did see. In the state's case against Kelsey Thomas has 3 components, and we're going to address all of those. 1 is her family, 2 is the medical examiner's opinion, and 3 is the confession itself. Now, as far as Kelsey's family is concerned, the interview will tell you, and we know this, the people that were close in Kelsey Thomas's life, outside her husband Aaron, her daughter Chloe, her son Phoenix, were her father that she saw almost every day and took him to his medical appointments, and Grandma Jody, who was the only one who really helped out with the babysitting. These were the people that knew something about Kelsey Thomas and her everyday life. You didn't hear any testimony from Grandma Jody or from Kelsey's dad about their concerns. And certainly, if they had those concerns, the state would have presented them as witnesses.
Objection, improper argument.
Sustained. Jury will disregard that last statement about the state would have presented them as witnesses. That is improper argument. Defense counsel is allowed to move on.
You did hear from Callie Cookett and Brittany Johnson, 2 people that were only tangentially related to Kelsey and her life. And you heard from Aaron Thomas. And Aaron was somebody who was involved in Kelsey's everyday life. And his tone and demeanor did change once he was on the stand compared to when he talked to me before, and that became apparent. He testified that Kelsey treated Chloe and Phoenix the same. He never saw any abuse. He contradicted Callie in a lot of respects, but indicated she's really not a part of our lives. Disappointingly, she never was. He would see Brittany maybe once or twice a year. On the day of Chloe's death, it was a normal day. It was part of our routine. These are the things that he did every day on days like this. There were no red flags, and he didn't sense that anything was wrong that day. He got 2 phone calls from Kelsey that day. The first phone call was pretty typical. Kelsey was mad that he wasn't home. No mention of Chloe. 5 minutes later, he gets another call, and Kelsey is frantic. And he doesn't know exactly what's going on, but he heard Chloe's name, and he knew something was wrong. That's important. If Kelsey Thomas had already killed Chloe, she's exercising an extreme amount of constraint and probably smarter than anybody would give her credit for to know that when these things are happening, I better not respond to them. Because right now I'm supposed to be sleeping. That's going to be my story. She knew that ahead of time. Somehow. Aaron Thomas was Kelsey's staunchest supporter until he was told about the confession. Kelsey never confessed to him. Kelsey never changed her story. What she said happened seemed possible to him. It was, again, all part of their routine for that day. In the end of his examination, he indicated that he felt Kelsey's demeanor was odd with law enforcement, although, ironically, none of the law enforcement officers said that Kelsey's demeanor was odd at that time, and had never actually mentioned that before. We have Callie Cookett, and the first question she answered on cross-examination, she admitted that her and Kelsey had never had a good relationship. And as you heard about Callie and Kelsey's relationship, you understood that that's because of Callie. She would see Kelsey as a young child, 5 to 6 times a year, until she was 10 years old. And they lived in the same town. She saw Kelsey and her family on holidays because she lived 2.5 hours away. And on direct, she tried to imply that the take-her conversation was more recent in time than what was actually the case. Because she admitted on cross-examination that in her deposition she said that conversation happened when Chloe was 3 years old, which meant that it was at least 2 years prior, that there was never any follow-up conversations to that conversation, and never any additional requests made. And even if you accepted everything that Callie said, it's really not even clear what she said that Kelsey was asking of her. Was this an extended weekend? Was this a little bit longer? So discussion of guardianship or paperwork going on? What is exactly that happened 2 years removed from Chloe's death? While she said that Kelsey appeared to pay more attention to Phoenix than Chloe, she also admitted that 2-year-olds, generally speaking, are going to require more attention than 5-year-olds. And again, Callie is making these observations in the context of family gatherings, where Chloe has other cousins that she's playing with. And Kelsey has other family members that she obviously has not seen for a long time. She's trying to catch up. Is that the family experience that we all have, that this is where our family's going to jump? Callie, without knowing anything of the situation, we heard from Aaron Thomas, accused both Kelsey and Aaron before knowing anything. Brittany Johnson calls while Kelsey is at the funeral home, and the very next thing she thinks is a good idea to do is go to the police station and volunteer to wear a wire and surveil her cousin. Both on their own. The state's making a big deal about this comment that when Callie finally did talk to Kelsey later that same day that Chloe died, after Kelsey had to go to the hospital and take care of all the things that she had to take care of. The state makes a big deal about Kelsey's apparent statement on eating. Ladies and gentlemen, that statement is not a comment on Kelsey and Chloe's relationship. That statement is a comment of Kelsey and Callie's relationship. Who are you? You haven't even been involved in my life, and now you're going to interrogate me about this? You don't have any idea. Aaron Thomas said the same thing. We heard from Brittany Johnson. I won't go over all of this because I really don't think that this has much of an impact. But she admitted that she had no idea who Kelsey would even reach out to. She just was not that close with Kelsey. She didn't confess anything to Brittany. And again, the state wants to make a big issue about, I guess, asserting some Freudian slip about why witnessed her die. Well, the reality is that Kelsey Thomas was in Chloe's bedroom and found her in some kind of state of distress. She didn't know if she was dead at that point. She didn't know if she was alive. But she told everybody the same story. Kelsey's alleged statement that she witnessed Chloe die doesn't mean anything other than what she always said it was. And she doesn't know when Chloe died. She went in there and she found something that was seared into her brain that she will never forget. Brittany also mentioned that Kelsey often talked about Chloe reminding Kelsey of her father. This is the only place this disjointed, tangential cousin that barely knows Kelsey, only place you've heard that evidence from. Wouldn't you think if this was such an issue for Kelsey in her life, that you'd be hearing from somebody who's actually close with her about that dynamic? Now, one of the things that Dr. Young had talked about was he wants to take all the evidence. And he took Kelsey Thomas's statement, and I want to make sure that you folks are clear with this. He wants the statements from everybody, not just Kelsey Thomas. So what did he say? He took into account Kelsey Thomas's statement, but he also took into account all of the law enforcement statements, all of the first responder statements as well. And as far as law enforcement and first responders, through the 911 call, through Corey Binge, through Kelsey's contacts with Blake Leffler that day, through the conversations that Tom McAndrew overheard her talk about, everything was consistent. She was panicked, she was crying, and she related the same story over and over and over again. And even that becomes problematic in the interrogations later on. Kelsey, how can you possibly be this consistent? What a lose-lose situation she's in. She's either too consistent and therefore lying, or she's not consistent enough and therefore she's lying. She is in a no-win situation, and that's not the only no-win situation or predicament that the state put her in. And so, again, the state's going to be making a big deal about, well, look at Kelsey's demeanor. Is this how you would expect somebody to react who just lost their daughter? And everybody's different, and that's been mentioned a few times. But what do we know about Kelsey Thomas's life? We know that her estranged mom, without knowing anything about it, comes to her house and accuses her and her husband. We know that her cousin is willing to surveil her. As far as her demeanor is concerned, a lot of the observations that are made are actually made of both Kelsey and Aaron Thomas, not just Kelsey. Aaron Thomas isn't charged with the death of Chloe Chandler. Aaron Thomas isn't a suspect in Chloe Chandler's death. But these same observations are made of both Kelsey and of Aaron. Brittany Johnson felt that both Aaron and Kelsey were acting out when she came over that day. and Investigator Saren testified that during the walkthrough, both were acting with little emotion, and he was surprised by that. The state asserted in their closing that Kelsey Thomas was mad at the police investigation. Never once did Kelsey Thomas say that she was mad at the police investigation. She was mad at the news coverage. She was mad that before she could even leave the hospital, KCCI already has the information on Facebook. That's what Kelsey Thomas was mad about. You'll see, and we'll pull it up here in a minute, a calendar of the days after Chloe's death. The only time that Kelsey wasn't being questioned by law enforcement was that weekend, and you can imagine from the things that she said in her interview, she was being inundated, as she said, on Facebook, on social media, by people she didn't even know, wanting to know what was going on. At what point, well, in fact, it wasn't until after she was in jail that people quit bugging her about what had happened. And finally, if you need an explanation for why Kelsey's demeanor is what it is, the simple fact is that Callie is her mother. And think about that, folks. Think about growing up in the same town as your own mother, and you see that person 5 or 6 times a year. What kind of emotional damage is that going to do to a young person? Now, we're here in the context of a murder trial, and that's what Kelsey Thomas is accused of. But if you were walking the street and met Kelsey, and you knew her history like that, would you expect her to be emotionally appropriate? Do you think growing up she was provided those tools? Certainly wasn't for Callie.
Objection, facts, not evidence.
Members of the jury, you will make your decision based only on the evidence. Counsel's speculation is not evidence. This is final argument. Not everything counsel says is going to be consistent with the evidence. That's for you to determine. So we'll move forward.
And we had medical examiners. And importantly, folks, as has been pointed out, when the county had this case, they thought it was non-accidental. It arrived at the medical examiner's office as non-accidental. And then the medical examiner didn't render an opinion that it was strangulation, not right away. She waited until after Kelsey Thomas's confession that it was a strangulation to find that. And you've heard me argue about how all those facts were twisted up. Again, don't just accept my argument. I'm going to show you how those facts were twisted up. But what we had is a situation in which Dr. Cavalier did not render an opinion until after this bogus confession. And I'm going to tell you and show you why it's bogus. And if that's the basis of her opinion, then you can't rely on her opinion either. And as far as Dr. Young is concerned, you heard him testify. He has a completely different opinion. And you heard the state try to impeach him with the credentials of his colleague 15 years ago. You know, folks, if somebody has to be impeached based on the actions of their colleague, that means in a 30-year career, Dr. Young really didn't have anything substantive for the state to attack in the first place. He wants to make an issue of, well, you were doing some work for the county, but you were getting paid for it. No. The state was just absolutely mistaken about that. Folks, you witnessed a false accusation right in front of your face. And it was false. The information was not true. So, and again, we heard from Dr. Thomas Young. His cause of death was hanging. Kelsey gave a detailed account, along with Bench's information, and all the other first responders. It was all consistent with Dr. Cavalier's findings. That's what he opined. He was even aware of Kelsey's confession, but felt that that confession was not consistent with the autopsy findings. And something that you folks haven't been asked to do yet, and we're going to do here while I'm up here, is we're going to just break down Kelsey Thomas's final confession in a common sense way. And I'll ask you folks if that actually makes sense. Or was it a situation where investigators finally thought that they had a story that fit the evidence that they needed, and they just quit asking questions at that point? Dr. Thomas said you can't take an autopsy and imagine or surmise past events because there can be many scenarios that can result in the same autopsy findings. Maybe one of the most repeated phrases that Dr. Cavalier said in her testimony was nonspecific. Those injuries were nonspecific. Those injuries could happen in a strangulation. Those injuries could happen in a hanging. We also heard of injuries that could happen just by natural death. Very little information that establishes this as a strangulation as opposed to a hanging. And if you understood Dr. Young's logic, you couldn't even draw that conclusion. You couldn't say one is more probable than the other because Dr. Cavalier can't say that. Dr. Cavalier has completely eliminated Kelsey's first account and is merely applying what findings she can to a strangulation by imagining what that strangulation would look like. And again, all that could make sense if you gloss over the fact that Kelsey confessed and then you look at what she said during her confession. But then if you understand that the investigators had already spoken to the medical examiner, they knew what the findings were, they knew what the findings had to be, and then told Kelsey what those findings had to be. And it's actually pretty amazing how closely what they tell her she needs to say matches with what she actually does say. Now, as far as where their opinions diverge, Dr. Young testified that as far as Dr. Cavalier's findings, Dr. Cavalier is saying those pajama pants couldn't have caused the abrasions to Chloe's neck and wouldn't expect such a prominent furrow. Dr. Young stated that there is often thrashing and hanging deaths, as you would expect there to be. It's highly speculative to assume that thrashing could not have caused those marks. She's guessing. Abrasions are commonly seen in hanging deaths and we expect to have seen abrasions even if there is no movement. So even if we assume that in that 3 to 15 seconds Chloe just waited there to die, there could still be those marks, according to Dr. Young. Even though the pajama pants were soft, they could bunch, and when stretched, it has folds. It could form 3/4 to half-inch wide ligature marks, consistent with the marks he observed on Chloe Chandler's neck. Dr. Young actually took a look at the pajama pants, and I asked him, is there anything about those pajama pants that's inconsistent with the marks that you observed at autopsy? His answer was no. Everything's consistent. Dr. Cavalier testified that she saw internal neck injuries and that it was surprised to see that. Dr. Young testified that hemorrhages without breaks are nonspecific. He testified that in strangulation cases, what you're going to look for is you're going to see breaks in the bones and the cartilages in the neck. And the hemorrhages that you typically see in those type of situations are related to those breaks. If you don't see the breaks and there's hemorrhages, they're nonspecific. That's exactly what the doctor told you. He had mentioned resuscitation efforts, which Dr. Cavalier does not take into account at all in rendering her opinion. And also doesn't take into account a rare disease that Chloe had that he said could contribute to the appearance of hemorrhages. And even without that disease, the hemorrhages again would not be indicative of a strangulation. Dr. Cavalier suggests that areas of pallor are indicative of fingerprints. And Dr. Young said, again, that's imagination. I don't know where she's getting that from. Even so, even if you wanted to believe Dr. Cavalier about that, can the state adequately explain why, in a strangulation scenario, that Chloe Chandler would reach up and try to move that ligature but for some reason, if she accidentally hung herself, she wouldn't also take that same action. There's no way to distinguish between those two things. It doesn't make sense. And we heard from Dr. Brian Cutler. Now, something about Dr. Brian Cutler, and you'll notice in his cross-examination, the state's position with him really isn't even at issue. They're not saying that the confession wasn't coercive. It was highly, highly coercive. And Dr. Cutler was hardly even challenged on that fact. And you heard Dr. Cutler testify about proven wrongful death cases, or wrongful conviction cases. Cases that, not empirical lab work, not things that don't have consequence, but real life situations. And he told you specifically about the guy on parole who falsely confessed to the crime, went to prison, and continued to lie and falsely confess so he could get a better benefit on parole. Then it wasn't until later DNA exonerated that person. So these things we know happen. And at one point, every one of those wrongfully convicted people were sitting right where Kelsey Thomas is sitting now, with 12 people who ultimately decided that that person was guilty. And they were wrong. So, what I want to do is I want to take a look at Kelsey Thomas's interview in a detailed way. And I have been making mention of how important it was for the state to impress upon Kelsey Thomas that those pajama pants could not have made the marks that she said they could. And that's where we start. So let's take a look at this. It was the state's job, through Michael Sarin and Don Schnickner, to convince Kelsey Thomas that those pajama pants could not have caused Chloe's injuries, which means that she must have been lying. Can't be the pants.
You've seen the signs. Look at evidence. The body, Chloe, is her. She's telling us the story. Even after she's dead, she's telling us her story. See the doctor.
They killed my
It took
daughter.
2 days to go through and confirm, to make sure that they were positive what they were telling us was the truth. They have no doubt. This isn't one person's idea. This was a team of people trying to figure out, again, your daughter's telling the story, and the other one's trying to figure out what happened by working things backwards, using Chloe, representing you with the story she's telling by her injuries.
I didn't touch my daughter. I didn't kill her. I didn't even touch her.
And again, we know that's not true because she wasn't strangled with those pants.
Well, she wasn't strangled with my hands. I didn't touch her.
We never said you strangled her with your hands.
I didn't kill my daughter.
We're saying that your daughter was not hung up in those closet with those pants.
Well, that is how I found her.
Not with those pants. We know that.
I found her hanging in the closet.
Not with those pants, though. You've watched TV, you've seen the signs. Look at evidence. The body. There isn't. That's why we're talking to you. There is no other explanation other than someone killed her, and that someone is you.
No, it isn't. What proof do you guys have that I did? Honestly.
We've been laying it out, Kelsey.
Just because you say marks and everything else. Do you have physical proof that I literally did
Do
it?
you need to see them to believe us?
What is picture going to show me?
It'll show that those pants are not the mechanism that caused her injuries, which makes your story a lie.
So what proof do you have that I did it?
That is it, right there. That's one piece, just one. And I will gladly go print those pictures out to show it to you, so maybe you can come off the bullshit you're spewing out of your mouth.
Now, in cross-examination, Michael Sarin tried to explain that what he meant was that those pants really couldn't have caused Chloe's injuries in the way that you described. That's not what he said. We just heard what he said. And what he meant really isn't important. What's important is the effect that it had upon Kelsey Thomas. And all that Kelsey Thomas heard repeatedly, according to Michael Sarin's own count, 35 to 40 times during this interview, they could not have banned the pants, Kelsey. That's how we know you're lying. And again, just from a common sense perspective, folks, even with Dr. Cavalier's explanation, and this is something, that we just had a hard time getting through. Has anyone explained to you how it is that the mechanism of injuries are going to be so vastly different from what Kelsey Thomas ultimately described in her confession of lassoing Chloe up and pulling back on her? How is that going to be substantially different than if Chloe was playing in the closet and accidentally hung herself by those same pajama pants? I don't understand, and no one's ever explained that to me. What's the distinction? What medical evidence is going to demonstrate that one is different than the other? Well, Dr. Cavalier talked about movement. Dr. Gunn says, no, that's not a factor. Again, just commonsensically. How would you expect that to look different? Now, our common sense position would be around this period of time in the video is Kelsey's breaking point. You see her repeatedly being told she's lying. We know you're lying, Kelsey. It wasn't those pants. Not only that, they start playing mind games with her. Watch the video. At one point, they tell her, Kelsey, she wasn't hanging in that closet. And Kelsey says, no, she was hanging in that, it looked like she was hanging in that closet. Oh, she looked like she was hanging in that closet. Do you know she was hanging in that closet? Well, it looked like she's hanging in that closet. The information's the same. She is not giving them any ammunition to attack her story, so they're inventing them. At one point, after repeatedly telling her, it's not those pants, Kelsey. Well, it looked like those pants. Well, are you wavering now? Are you sure that it's those pants? Christ. You can feel Kelsey Thomas's exasperation as she's being asked these ridiculous questions. At one point they posit, well, so Kelsey, what you're telling us is that Chloe must have done this herself and then hung herself up into the closet? Give me a break. She's starting to question what she even remembers at this point. And she tells them on more than one occasion, you're messing with my head. You're trying to get me to admit to something I didn't do. She warns them, this is what's happening. And this is after 12 plus hours where she maintains the same story. And all of a sudden she's agreeing to everything. And we'll see that. Now, it was made mention, I believe, in opening statements. There were things that only Kelsey knew, and it was in fact reasserted in closing. Only things that Kelsey knew. That's how we know we got the right person. She had unique information. Well, the things that Mr. Neff had talked about in opening, that I recall, well, Kelsey volunteered it. Chloe was playing in the bathroom that day. Do we even know that that happened or not? There's no photographs from the bathroom. If something was going on in the bathroom, you'd actually expect that the crime scene would have probably started in the bathroom. The bathroom really doesn't impact anything with the story one way or another. But it's apparently means that Kelsey is telling the truth about the honest confession that she got because nobody asked her about the bathroom before. Her lips were blue. Well, you know, Chloe's lips were blue when Kelsey found Chloe. And Chloe's lips would have been blue under either circumstance. So really, the fact that Chloe's lips were blue really, again, doesn't demonstrate one scenario or favor one scenario or the other. And then there's this stare. And folks, again, we'll try to make sense of this when we talk about this in a commonsensical way. But what Kelsey Thomas said in that interview is that she threw Chloe into bed, held her down, and that she started staring at me. The investigators didn't equate this with a death stare. That wasn't something that even came up until Dr. Cavalier made mention of it. Dr. Young, again, thinks that's imagination. But as far as all of the original statements, all the things that we know had to come from Kelsey because they're unique and therefore demonstrates that she's guilty, let's take a look at those. Or is there anything more than this? Because I think this is easily explained. And this goes back to what Dr. Brian Cutler talked to us about. This interrogation was a guilt presumptive interrogation. And by that, the investigators, when they started with Kelsey Thomas, assumed that she was guilty. The process involves using techniques to get the suspect to confess, easier to give them more details about crime that investigators can use to corroborate. And that's actually the process that we see going on, because at first, they get Kelsey to admit, yeah, I did in fact touch her, and that's where things touch off. And maybe that looks like a good investigation moving forward, a good interrogation moving forward. But the thing is again, none of the facts are unique to Kelsey. They didn't originate with Kelsey. They originated with investigators. And the problem, as Dr. Cutler indicated, and again, and his testimony was pretty much uncontroverted, the problem with guilt presumptive interrogation is that police are not always interrogating guilty people. And this is one of the problems that leads to false confessions. So, with Dr. Cutler, we reviewed his report, and he talked about known risk factors for a false confession. Known risk factors, things that have happened in false confession cases that we know have happened, that are coercive, that create problems in how reliable or not that alleged confession is. He talked about rapport building tactics, used 12 times, evidence-based tactics, used 132 times, emotional provocation, used 12 times, confrontational tactics, used 153 times, minimization tactics, used 65 times. Dr. Cutler testified that in that 3-hour interview, she was subjected to 374 times in which these tactics were used against her. He also reviewed in another interview, he said that Kelsey was wearing different clothing. That's how he knew it was a different interview. And those tactics were present in that interview as well, although his report didn't get into that analysis. And he also talked about this alternative option concept. And we see this play out in this case as well. Throughout Kelsey Thomas's interrogation, she is given 2 options, and only 2 options. Her options are, she's this monster who just got fed up with her daughter and premeditatedly killed her, which Kelsey, we know that's not the case. We know that you're a good mom. We just know that you snap. And that looks so much better on you, and it's so much easier to explain to your family. And this is your only option. Because there's only two, and we really don't want to think you're a monster. Innocence was never an option in Kelsey Thomas's interrogation. It was not something that Michael Sayre or Don Schnicker was going to consider. Dr. Cutler testified that interrogators are taught to cut them off when they start explaining away their involvement. And we see that happen in this case as well. Finally, Dr. Cutler talked about confession contamination. And he told you that confession contamination is where you don't know if the details were learned throughout the case itself, or if they were gathered personally. So was investigators feeding Kelsey Thomas this information, or was this information organic to things that Kelsey Thomas told investigators? He said what you want to do is you want to track down where the where that information came from, who said what first. Did the suspect provide unique details, or was it the investigators? So let's take a look at all of the statements that were adopted by Kelsey Thomas in her ultimate confession that were first told to her by investigators. And context is important, folks, and I'll tell you just like the state did. You'll have a copy of that interview. You don't have to trust me that my arguments are accurate. You can take a look at the video and know that everything as we go through is in the order as I've indicated. It's all timestamped. You can take a look at that for yourself. So, the first concepts that we're talking about is that Kelsey had taken a nap hoping that Chloe would be okay, and that she had held her down.
I want to know what Mom was thinking. Mom was thinking, she wakes up and finds her child, she's hanging in the bed. It doesn't know how that happened, hanging in the closet. How that happened. I don't know! And I think that's what you want, but something happened before that, Kelsey, whether it was a fight, whether it was whatever.
There was no argument between me and her.
Maybe something happened and you went to bed thinking, that just didn't happen. I'm going to wake up and she's going to be okay. We had a fight in the room. She wouldn't stay down. I held her down.
No.
She passed out. She's asleep. I'm going to go back to bed. And when I wake up, we'll make up like we always do. She'll be okay. I'll get my nap in. I'll be more prepared for her.
No.
And when we go back in that room, oh my gosh, I must have went too far. She's
No.
dead. Now what do I do?
No.
Now I need to make it look like an accident.
No.
Sound familiar?
It can make sense that maybe she did come out of her room. I don't know. I didn't went there before we took her out. Maybe threw her on the bed or held her down on the bed. I want her to just stay in bed. Just stay in the bed and I'll beat your butt. And you held her down. And something happened. And you thought she was just going to stay in bed. And you didn't realize how much bullshit you were. And then she was taking a nap. You tried to wake her up and she wouldn't wake up. And you panicked. I understand that.
Very familiar.
It can make sense that maybe she we can go through
And to orient you folks, this is after Kelsey has now adopted the thing that she was told by investigators. She's now told investigators, yeah, she did come out of her room even though I always claimed she didn't. And when she came out of her room, I brought her to her bed and I held her down and I told her she needs to take a nap or I'm going to beat her butt, and I held her down. Exactly like Don Schnicker told her she should say. After getting that, Don Schnicker is now telling her, all right, Kelsey, now we need to make it believable.
feeling that you didn't need to help support your story that she strangled on something?
No,
You didn't tie anything around her neck at that point?
No.
You found her dead?
no, no.
So she's confessed at this point. Why is she denying putting anything around her neck?
You know, at the line when you talk about that, okay, because I need to be clear. I need to make sure that, because if the doctor comes back and says, you know, I think that something's pulled over her mouth, she's got to find the handle the size of it. 100 years, 10 years between something's coming back to her mouth. That's screwed up. So I don't want them to say, you know, because now it's out there. And, you know, what happened to Chloe came from you. Okay? We don't know that nothing's out, so we'll pass that part. We just don't want the doctor to say, you know, I think actually she must have came behind her with something and pulled up on her. And that's how it happened. Maybe.
She must have come behind her with something and pulled up on her. That's how it happened, maybe. Sounds exactly what Kelsey Thomas later says had happened. The gasping.
Did you notice when the mom went right away?
No, when I,
Gasping and because these are things the doctor's going to ask. When pressure is exerted on the neck and the chest, this is what should be seen.
no, I mean, like I said, when I had my hands on her chest, I mean, I was, and see, I didn't,
Was her head hanging off the bed?
no,
Are you sure?
yes,
Yes, I'm.
Kelsey heard her gasping. That means she must have been there when Chloe died. Well, the investigator suggested that one as well. The mechanism, here's what we need.
Right, now I gotta worry about myself and being something else, right? Do you think, because we're gonna test like the pajama bottoms that we pointed out, like DNA, Mexican, is there any way that to make sell your story that maybe you wrapped her around her neck and held it there for a little bit
no,
after she was deceased? What about, you're not gonna find that from, is that in play at all? Would you use the pajama pants on at all? If you would drag her back to her room the first time, is there anything that I'm gonna see that transfer?
I mean, I didn't drag her, I didn't let her go.
Is there any way that to make her sell your story, that maybe you wrapped that around her neck and held it there for a little bit after she was deceased? No. And here we're getting to where Kelsey is finally getting to the final version, the ultimate confession. This is what Kelsey Thomas says about this.
And she had jumped in her bed, and as I was coming, I came into her room, and she had jumped out of her bed, and I tried to grab her arm, and she slipped out of my arm and went to run out of her bedroom. I grabbed the pants, and I just went like this, and I pulled.
Where was she at?
She was in her room. She was, I mean, like I said, I tried to grab her arm, which stopped her, and she had turned and got my arm out, or got her arm out of my hand. So I grabbed the pants and I flung them over her, and then when I pulled, I don't know, honestly, if I had twisted or, you know, I know she had turned around. Because when I grabbed her, pulled her backwards, she had turned.
The problem is this doesn't explain everything, so the investigators continue. And they still need evidence of suspicion, because that is the most prominent thing, the most prominent injury, the thing that stands out the most, is that suspension injury. The upward canted litigation furrow is a telltale sign of a hanging and not strangulation. We heard that from both sides.
I mean, yes, I grabbed her, but I don't remember lifting her or anything other than whatever that.
And then we have the final version. And interestingly, and this is going to be pretty interesting. The state is trying to address this line on the back of Chloe's neck.
I still see that line on the back, but I need to figure it out. Okay. So I'm gonna let you kind of talk a little bit. When you're talking, I can just hear it from there. I'm really not gonna follow with some more
go over this too much, but this is that line on the back of the neck that the investigators are asking about in that clip. And you heard Dr. Cavalier testify that that is most likely an autopsy artifact. That Chloe Chandler, at the time of autopsy, would have had sort of a block set up under her head for the performance of autopsy, and that's what an artifact is an injury after death in the process of going through the autopsy. The investigators didn't know that at the time, and then they had to go about convincing Kelsey Thomas that she was also responsible for this autopsy artifact. The investigators were so persuasive with Kelsey Thomas, she admitted to all the injuries that they needed to have her admit to in order for her story to line up with the injuries on Chloe Chandler. They also even convinced her of injuries that did not result from Chloe Chandler's death. Isn't that interesting? And so then we get the final version, which, again, she just says here, and we'll listen to it. But, like I said, she's sort of filling in what was said before.
It was that you held on to her, or that Jeff was pushing on her.
It seemed like maybe, a split second when I did it.
Jokes with her when that happened.
I heard her gasping for air, and when I grabbed her, she had a little like, and then that was it.
You remember what Jeff was really up to, I don't know. It's true.
So we heard after her confession Kelsey Thomas denying that she ever lifted her off the ground, denying that she ever heard her gasp, and now that everything's out and she's in her final version, yeah, whatever else you need. Sure, I heard her gasping, yeah, and I did pick her up after all. And then we have the letter that she wrote at the same table where officers stepped out of the room. She had nothing else to do but write this letter.
I can't think too much else that I think we need to go over on that. I think sometimes I want to make sure we're clear. I brought some pen and paper in. Some people, you're with on it. How it comes down. That's a long one. You want to write it down just so people know what happened. And you're sorry that you was the prosecutor. That's just not my words. You have that opportunity. That's up to you. Sometimes it helps.
So, again, while glossing over the facts, folks, you hear about this case. Yeah, it's a confession case, and then she wrote this letter to her family. Again, context is important. And that confession letter, I would assert to you folks, would mean a whole lot more if that were Kelsey's idea, if that were organic, if that were something that she had thought of or requested. But here again, we're seeing prosecutors setting Kelsey up to make it look like she is as guilty as she possibly can. And, we follow up with the jail calls. A couple things about the jail calls. One, if you listen to that first jail call, you'll understand that Kelsey Thomas is probably in the process of being booked through the jail. So when you see the very end of that interview, there's really not a whole lot of time. It's a matter of minutes from the time she completes that interview to when she's actually calling Aaron Thomas. So if the state wants to assert, look, there is no interrogation, everything was over, Dr. Cutler addresses that. Those things happen. People are in a situation where, and again, Kelsey Thomas specifically in this case, look, everything that we can see points to two scenarios. Either you're this horrible, horrible person, which we don't want to believe, or you just snapped. And this is what happened. Those were her only two options, and those were her only two options from the time that Saren and Schnicker sat down with her. We know these things happen because they happen not in research, not in empirical studies. They happen in real life. And if they've happened before, why couldn't it have happened in this case? This is not a situation where I'm just throwing this out there. Hey, maybe this is a false confession without any basis for it just because my client confessed. You heard Dr. Cutler testify. Not everything that he reviews is a coercive interrogation. There's only been 11 circumstances. He set up his whole business for this kind of consultation. And only 11 times since he started this practice did it actually result in Dr. Cutler taking the stand to provide testimony. It's not just some paid opinion. In fact, I don't even need Dr. Cutler to establish those things. I needed Dr. Cutler to open your folks' eyes to the possibility that this actually happened. And now I'm demonstrating to you how it's true. Because again, there is nothing original, nothing unique about Kelsey Thomas's confession. Nothing that you can point to say, only Kelsey Thomas would know that piece of information, and that's why we know she's guilty. And again, Dr. Brian Cutler testified about this. This is a tactic. They teach this in interrogation classes. Don't give them an option that gives them the way out. Kelsey Thomas was either the monster mom or the mom that snapped. And of those two, obviously, it sounds a lot better. It sounds like maybe your family would at least let you talk to them. Maybe, even though you're still going to be punished, everybody in my life isn't going to view me as a monster. Can I at least hold on to that little thing, that little shred that you're leaving for me? That's what Kelsey Thomas was trying to hold on to. That's what that man that you had heard from Dr. Cutler was trying to hold on to when he was telling the parole board, yes, I did it, when in fact he knew he did not. So let's take a look and summarize all the statements that Kelsey Thomas adopted from the investigators. These are all statements that Kelsey Thomas did not state for herself until investigators suggested to her this is what she should say. It was suggested to Kelsey Thomas that she went and took a nap hoping that Chloe would be okay. It was suggested to Kelsey Thomas when Kelsey had insisted for 12 hours, she never came out of that room. Look, Chloe misbehaved sometimes and she didn't like to take a nap and she didn't come out of her room, or she came out of her room most of the time. She didn't this time. Kelsey Thomas didn't question that. The state makes this big deal about, oh, well, Kelsey Thomas thought it was so important that Chloe take a nap. That's not how I view things. If you look at that, what was important was Kelsey Thomas have an opportunity to give herself a nap. She really didn't care if Chloe was taking a nap or not. She just wanted Chloe in her room so she could take a nap. It didn't matter if Chloe was playing around. It didn't matter if Chloe was playing in the closet and swinging from things in the closet. It didn't matter. She was tired. That sounds like neglect, if anything. They asked Kelsey Thomas if she heard Chloe gasp, and that would be something that the doctors would talk to them about.
Objection, the state's facts, not evidence.
That was a direct quote, Your Honor.
Members of the jury, you'll recall the evidence and you can review it if you like. This is argument, it's not evidence. We'll move forward.
They made sure that Kelsey accounted for the evidence of suspension. Again, the most significant, obvious evidence in this case. They needed to make sure Kelsey accounted for that, and they did. They even made sure Kelsey accounted for an artifact, something that doesn't make sense. And again, that piece right there demonstrates to you just exactly how persuasive Saren and Schnickner were in telling Kelsey how this story had to go. They suggested that she write the letter immediately after her confession, and they left the room and gave her time to do that when she had nothing else to do. And again, I'll point out, Dr. Cutler's expert opinion, he's certainly qualified. I don't know that I could have found a grander expert on the issue. He literally was writing the books. What did he say? Probably one of the most coercive investigations I've ever reviewed. And this guy is immersed in this stuff. Probably the most coercive I've ever reviewed. And he's been involved in seeing false confession cases. His unchallenged opinion was this was a highly coercive interrogation, the kind of which could lead both a guilty and an innocent person to confess. So, as I indicated, if in the state's closing argument they're asserting that Kelsey Thomas knew facts only that she would know because she is guilty, what are those facts? Have you heard any? And finally, does her final version make sense? So, and again, you'll have the recording. You don't have to trust everything I'm showing you. This is my argument. I'm confident if you review everything, you're not going to find anything to disagree with my position on these things, because this is how it is. But Kelsey Thomas's final version that law enforcement accepted, and it probably comes forward, or it's something you'll be able to see more clearly if you look at the walkthrough video. But Chloe's room is a tiny little room. Okay? So Kelsey Thomas says in her final confession, she runs into the room, this tiny little room. Somehow Chloe gets past her. It's really not plausible if you look at the size of that room, but somehow Chloe gets past her. She grabs her arm. But then Chloe slips out of her arm. Somehow, then she has time to grab the pajama pants, and that lasso goes over to get, it seems nonsensical, right? Why, if she had a hold of her arm, and she has to go grab the pants and then go do this, how does that make sense? Kelsey says, and again, this is her final version, she lassos Chloe, and then she pulls, and then Chloe is twisting, and she's almost facing her. She has to say this to account for the autopsy artifact, that line on the back of her neck. That was the piece that she had to add. So Chloe twists around. It's not immediately clear, it's not clear at all, I believe, at what point she says she lifts her up. But if she's lifting her up with Chloe facing her, then that doesn't seem consistent with the marks that we see. And even if Chloe was still turned around and she lifted up, she describes like a quick second action going on. And we've seen that mark. Without any further explanation, folks, I think a person would look at the ligature marks on Chloe Chandler's neck and believe that she was hung. Because not only is it prominent, not only is it thick, it looks like it had been there for a while. Is that what Kelsey Thomas described? No. She described, she pulled back, and then Chloe gasped, and she let go. And she was facing her. And then, after she collapsed, she picks her up and brings her to the bed. And again, maybe that's a little bit too much stepping, because here's the bed, and here's the floor, and there's the door. So there's really not a whole lot of room. Picks up Chloe, sets her in her bed, and then pushes on her. And that's when she has to stare. Folks, there is no injury whatsoever to Chloe's chest, to any internal organs in her chest. But according to Kelsey Thomas's story, this is when the death stare happened, right? She pushes on her and she's staring at me. What possibly could have killed Chloe Chandler at that point? If, in fact, this were a death stare. It doesn't make sense. Her story doesn't make sense. But she confessed, and that was the important part. We got her to confess. We've already been at her for 14 hours now. I think we're good enough. I think we're good. Ladies and gentlemen, I've given you more than ample reason to just set aside the confession for a minute. Let's talk about everything else that's going on in this case. Because you know, I just demonstrated to you. Anybody given the information that Kelsey Thomas was given could give an explanation about how Chloe Chandler died. Anybody could have done that. You just saw officers set her up to say exactly what she said. Not one original thought there. That makes a difference.